What if I told you that back in the 2000s, there was a video game adaptation of a religious franchise based on the Book of Revelation? And no, I'm not talking about Shin Megami Tensei, but a Western game made by people who actually believe in it. Well, if you're a millennial or a Gen Xer and you grew up in a certain type of evangelical Christianity, I don't need to explain Left Behind to you. If you're not in that narrow demographic category, I don't know if I could adequately explain Left Behind to you, but I can try. To do so, I will need to use my history degree for once. We have to go back to the 19th century. I can see your eyes glazing over, please bear with me. In the 1830s and 1840s, a religious group was founded in England called the Plymouth Brethren, not to be confused with the Pilgrims, Brownist Puritans who left Plymouth, or the Anabaptist Church of the Brethren. Eventually, Plymouth Brethren congregations were founded in the United States as well. The Plymouth Brethren were kind of unusual in a lot of ways. They didn't have organized clergy, for example. The Open Brethren, a specific group within the Plymouth Brethren, didn't even have formal membership. Anyone who considered themselves a member was considered a member. One of their early members was John Nelson Darby. Darby developed a system of theology called dispensationalism, the idea that what God expected from his followers changed based on dispensations. So, for example, Adam and Eve had a specific set of rules to follow, don't eat the forbidden fruit. Noah had rules to follow, the Noahide law, as Jewish scholars call it. Moses had received a dispensation at Mount Sinai, the Torah, that outlined the rules for the Israelites, and so Darby argued Christians were expected to follow Jesus in this dispensation, and future dispensations might have different rules as well. Darby was also what was known as a premillennialist. He believed that the millennium spoken of in Revelation 20 was something that was coming in the future. This was in contrast to amillennialism, which viewed the millennium as symbolic, or views like preterism or post-millennialism that view the Book of Revelation referring to events that have already happened. Put these two together, you have dispensational premillennialism. You see, Darby believed that the church and Israel were two separate entities and were subject to two different dispensations. Christianity had historically taught that the church had become the new spiritual Israel, and thus prophecies of Israel referred to the church. Darby's view was that there were still future prophecies to be fulfilled in Israel. Fast forward to the year 1909, American Cyrus Scofield, calling himself a reverend even though no institution had ever granted him that title or degree, wrote a Bible full of footnotes, the Scofield Reference Bible. This Bible popularized Darby's ideas. One of the distinctives of this Bible was the way it jumped back and forth through the Bible in order to string verses together in support of Darby's ideas. Context be darned. You read a bit from Ezekiel, a bit from Daniel, a bit from Revelation, throw a dash of Isaiah in for good measure. This really developed dispensational premillennialism and sort of popularized it among the readers of Scofield's Bible. Let's fast forward again to the year 1948. 1948, the modern nation of Israel was created by declaration after the end of the British Mandate. Many premillennialists saw this as a fulfillment of prophecy. Many of Darby, Scofield, et al.'s predictions assumed that Israel would exist at the end time, so the creation of a modern state of Israel was assumed to be a prerequisite for everything else. Add to that the idea that the Antichrist would need to defile the Jewish temple that currently does not exist, and you see why the desire for a rebuilt temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem was a part of this premillennialist ideology. And quite frankly, this is still the reason for widespread evangelical support for Israel today. On that note, let's talk about evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is a label that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people and in different contexts. It's often used to mean fundamentalist or conservative. But the original evangelicals referred to Christians who emphasize personal conversion experiences, Bible reading, personal piety, and activism over institutional identity. As the fundamentalist modernist controversies of the early 20th century raged, many evangelicals split from the more mainline denominations. Many of these evangelicals were quite a bit more fundamentalists and politically conservative than their mainline counterparts. As time went on, evangelicals tended to focus less on personal piety and Bible study, tended to focus more heavily on conservative political activism. There's nothing inherently conservative about evangelicalism, but a lot of these evangelicals were already politically conservative outside of their religious beliefs, and begin to focus on that rather than on the other distinctives of their faith. It's kind of making it your whole personality, but for religious institutions. Bible literacy actually dropped among evangelicals over this period of time. While evangelicals of the past were more likely to be able to quote the Bible than mainline Protestants or Catholics, the shift in focus for evangelicals, and a continuance of formal religious education among the more institutional Christians, has actually reversed this trend. By the end of the 20th century, evangelical had become a synonym for the religious right. This especially affected Pentecostal and Baptist denominations. Both Pentecostals and Baptists tend to have decentralized authority structures and independence from denominational oversight. These decentralized power structures tended to attract people with more fringe ideas, like, at the time, dispensational premillennialism. The emergence of a type of decentralized evangelical church blending elements from Pentecostalism and the Baptists, sometimes jokingly called the Bapticostals, proved to be fertile ground for these evangelical ideas, and the Darbyist ideas put forth by Schofield. In the 1970s and 1980s, as a reaction to the social and political upheaval of the 60s, a conservative religious movement emerged. This new religious right was best exemplified by the organization The Moral Majority. Led by Southern Baptist preacher Jerry Falwell, this organization pushed anti-LGBTQ policies, anti-feminist policies, pro-choice politics. Traditional family values was often the term that they used. Many of the early Moral Majority leaders had also been pro-segregation not long before, and had been anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic. The influence of the Southern Baptist Convention can't be understated here. While the Moral Majority was officially simply Christian, it was dominated by Southern Baptists, many of whom had opposed the attempts by the federal government to desegregate the South. However, these views tended to soften as conservative black churches, pro-choice Catholics, and pro-Israel Jews began to be recognized by these Moral Majority preachers as potential allies rather than enemies. The Moral Majority adjacent ideas spread like wildfire through the aforementioned evangelical churches. Conservatives within those churches learned to put a religious veneer over the political views they held separately from their religious beliefs. Tim LaHaye, co-author of the Left Behind books, had been a founding member of this organization. And yeah, all this leads to the religious right supporting Trump, but that's a video for another day. Okay, so we are finally up to the kind of important part, but we're still in the 1970s and 80s. In the year 1970, American evangelical pastor Hal Lindsey wrote the book, The Late Great Planet Earth. This book brought dispensational premillennialist ideas to the mainstream of the emerging Christian right. The book was extremely influential, and these theological ideas were somewhat fringe until Lindsey came along and made them mainstream. From Lindsey's influence, other preachers and theologians with similar views, but often getting slightly different details, emerged, including Tim LaHaye, a John Bircher, and a premillennialist theologian. Let's talk about the John Birch Society for a moment. Tim LaHaye had been, in addition to a founder of the Moral Majority, a member of the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society was a right-wing organization that was ostensibly an anti-communist advocacy group. They managed to gather an immense amount of influence over the American right, though, opposing government overreach, pushing for a sort of American rugged individualism that came to characterize the right's rhetoric in the 1980s through the 2000s. They also do talk a lot about international bankers and elites that control the world. They really need Jews. Yes, the John Birch Society was rather anti-Semitic. Tim LaHaye, being a John Bircher, is really relevant to the way he described the end of the world. LaHaye's views of the end times are heavily influenced by ideas like the idea that pacifists are actually evil and secretly just want to take your guns so the elites can take over, that these elites have a conspiracy to install the Antichrist as a dictator, and that the UN is actually a powerful global government instead of the fairly powerless NGO it actually is. And it's in all of these contexts that the Left Behind books developed. Starting in 1996, Tim LaHaye worked with the author Jerry B. Jenkins to write a series of novels portraying LaHaye's version of the premillennialist version of the end of the world. You know, I should also take a minute to draw a comparison to the 1970s church-funded movies, A Thief in the Night. They made 4 of these movies. They weren't good, but I gotta admit they had heart. You can actually tell that the guy making these movies, who was a pastor, actually believed that he was going to save people with them. The vibe of The Thief in the Night is actually a lot different from Left Behind. Thief in the Night had this attitude that there was this real, looming danger of going to hell and that you had to be saved. The pastor that created them seemed to sincerely want people to see his film, think about the end of the world, and turn to Jesus. Left Behind had a different style entirely. Left Behind wasn't really written to convert people. It really was written for the already converted. Left Behind had this undertone that was a lot more mean-spirited. It always felt less like, repent for the kingdom of God is at hand, and more like, haha, you're gonna be left while I go to heaven. But that's a bit of a digression. Left Behind was released as a series of poorly written and vaguely racist books from 1995 to 2007. They wrote 16 of these books, plus a side series written for kids. There were movies, Bible study guides. I believe there was even a soundtrack that had songs inspired by it or something. It became a huge franchise, but within a very specific conservative evangelical subculture. But these books were not good. They were very poorly written, and it's especially bad when your poorly written book has a main character who is a writer, so the examples of his brilliant writing are themselves not well written. They're poorly written, poorly researched, sexist in a way that's hard to articulate, and extraordinarily anti-Semitic in a way I don't really need to articulate. But frankly, I don't want to focus on any of that. I want to focus on what I think is the strangest part of the franchise, which is that they made a video game of it. Left Behind Eternal Forces was a real-time strategy game based on the Left Behind books. It's not an adaptation per se, but rather fills into the gaps of the book's story. The game requires you to go through New York, preaching to people, figuring out how to feed and house them, and opposed by the weird John Birch Society version of the UN that's totally not anti-Semitic, I swear. Although that's a criticism of the books more than the games. The anti-Semitism doesn't quite come out the same in the games as it does in the books. In order to progress, you send missionaries out to convert neutral units to your side. You can then buy real estate, produce what your units need, can work to convert more people. The newly converted units can eventually be trained into specialized roles: missionaries, musicians, builders, soldiers. The conversion works by giving each unit a spirit level. Your missionaries and musicians raise the spirit level of neutral and even evil units, and when it gets high enough, they convert to good Christians and join you. Your own units can also raise their own spirit levels by prayer. However, the Antichrist is also trying to convert your units, and if the spirit levels drop below a certain point, they become evil. Their side has the opposite of prayer, cursing apparently, which lowers the unit's own level. Interestingly, since a lot of evangelicals believe in eternal security after salvation, if the spirit level of a good unit drops too low, it can return to being neutral, so that's a bit at odds with the game's religious message. The game immediately got bad press for claims it'd be some sort of jihad simulator, but honestly, a lot of that was overblown. In fact, the game's system actually discourages this. Killing another unit drops the unit's spirit level. I think it's supposed to be like PTSD, the unit eventually gets disillusioned and leaves maybe, but it also means that the enemy is actually incentivized to kill your units. And that's actually a bold move to make a real-time strategy game where you're discouraged from eliminating your enemy units the more traditional way. The enemy can kill with impunity, but you can't, and that absolutely changes your strategy and gives you a major limitation to try to work around. And again, it's kind of at odds with LaHaye's own views about pacifism. It does make it seem like whoever made this game had a bit more creative freedom than we might think. I actually kind of like how you have to buy buildings and convert neutral units rather than just building it all from scratch. It's at least different from the StarCraft clone that it could have been. Also, you unlock contemporary Christian music to listen to within the game's menu when you beat a level. You can't listen to it during gameplay or outside the game, but still, it's kind of cool. Now for the bad things. Sometimes, you just lose, without really being sure why. I'm sure it's the result of either a bug or just objectives not being clear or something, but it doesn't really make the game any more fun. I almost think that sometimes if you take too long to beat a level, it will eventually cause you to lose, but I haven't quite figured out why that would be. The sexism present in the books does bleed through into the game as well. For some reason, women can't be construction workers or soldiers. They try to compensate for this by making the prayer warrior, one of the most powerful units in the game, exclusively female. But does this mean men can't pray? There's some serious late 19th century women are more pious than men stuff to this. It's like the complementarian view of separate spheres. Actually, given the game, it's probably exactly that. For some reason, the creators also seem unaware that Christian rock exists, except for all the contemporary Christian music included in the game. But the evil musicians are all rock guitarists who blare their guitar to lower your spirit level, as if listening to rock music was somehow inherently corrupting, while the good musicians are all gospel singers. One thing the game is missing is the absolute mean level obsession with 90s telephone technology that the books had. If you've read those blog posts, you know what I'm talking about. Buck Williams, when he's not being a homophobic douche, is getting off to pictures of phone jacks and technical standards for voice over IP. Overall, this game is a lot more milquetoast than it seems like it would be. As a game, it's poorly done, but actually has some interesting ideas that stem from its agenda rather than being despite it. But it also has some less savory elements, again, stemming from its agenda. The acceptability of its agenda will depend on your religious and political beliefs. The quality of the game, separate from that, is simply okay at best, and there's not much more to say about it other than that.